Thanks, Lynn. My name's Colin MacLeod. I'm the Director for the National Centre of Religious Studies, and I'm also the Chair of the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Committee for Interfaith Relations. It's a real privilege to be able to speak into this space of religious diversity. It's something I hold very dear to my heart and something that I hope this session might encourage you to engage with as well as just learn about. Look, I want to introduce the committee, most of them as they are. This isn't the whole group. Bishop Michael Dooley and Christopher Longhurst from Wellington and Daniel Kleinsman from Wellington are not present. But this is Beate Matthews. She's representative in Auckland, Teresa Fernandez in Hamilton, Matt Gardner in Christchurch, it's myself. There's Adele Churchman, who is also part of the Christchurch Interfaith crew, and Mary Easton from Palmerston North, who does amazing work there, and they've also produced a book recently that I might mention later. This is Sister Bertha, who's recently retired. Look, the committee has put together this particular booklet that will be of use to you. The link is here. I strongly encourage you to download it and to use it as part of your research and also part of your own faith formation and background in terms of engaging as a Catholic in interfaith dialogue. One of the key issues that we're going to be looking at as we go through this is, you know, what are the challenges for people of one faith when engaging with another? And particularly in our context, because we're a Catholic organisation, we're going to look at it from a Catholic perspective and see how that sort of shapes up. So I just want you to think where you're at. Now, we won't have time for a conversation, but it's worth picking up, I think, when you get back to your own teachers and the likes, and have a think about who are the people of other religions who you've actually met, and what is it about their faith that comes through? I think in a lot of New Zealand contexts, secular New Zealand is actually struggling to come to terms with the reality that we have many cultures that often involve many faiths. So that we're fine with cultural diversity, and we get that as in the ministry or the Office of Ethnic Communities, which is becoming a ministry. We're quite happy to talk with people of different cultures. They've really got no idea, or only starting to get an idea of what it means that they also hold a range of different faith perspectives that influence their culture. They're not two separate things. Culture and faith are pretty much intertwined. So you thinking about what religions, people you know of other religions, and the types of dialogues that you might have actually had. It's all very well looking at differences and similarities, but often it's the way that is actually talked about that actually opens your heart and opens your mind to what's going on. And then the other thing to think about is if someone invited you to Eid al-Fitr, now if you are Muslim, this won't be a surprise, you will have been to many Eid al-Fitr meals. But if you are someone like me, when I first got invited to an Eid al-Fitr, I wasn't sure what was going to go on there. The praying that took place at the start was it was a bit scary, to be honest. Once I got there and met people who invited me in and welcomed me into the mosque, this was in Dunedin in my case, it's happened a few times, you suddenly realise that these are just warm-hearted people that are inviting you to their place of prayer and to the meal afterwards, which usually is pretty amazing. And a key question is why you would go or not go. Is it out of fear? Is it out of interest that you really want to see what's taking place? Is it out of concern that you might offend them by being a Catholic person? Keep talking from that context. I'm not assuming that you are all Catholic, but just in this context. And is it that you are worried that your own faith will somehow be challenged by being there? Is it a place that you might not be allowed to be? Of course you are allowed to be there. Praying alongside people of other communities is not a problem. You need to be a bit awake as to what it is that you are praying, because you should engage with your heart and mind in prayer, not just follow along. But you can do that on the fly, and and if the words you're thinking, well, I'm not sure if this is what I believe, it's very simple to just be quiet, to actually stand there and to participate in that way. Similarly, think then, well, what about a Passover meal, something that is arguably closer to us? We have Holy Thursday, which resonates with Passover. There are attributes of that sort of flow through. So if we put ourselves physically in a place where we are encountering people of other faiths and entering into their celebrations, why do you think the church itself would engage with other religions? So we're talking about it at the start at a personal level. And the primary understanding is that everyone is made in the image and likeness of God. Doesn't matter what religion people belong to from a Catholic perspective, the fact that they're all made in the image and likeness of God is something that unites us all. We don't go so far as to say that everyone is a brother or sister of Jesus. We would say that amongst ecumenical communities, other Christian groups, and if we're talking about religious diversity, remember we need to keep in mind the fact that There are a range of Christians as well, or groups of Christians, as much as there are a range of people of different faiths and no faiths. So in a sense, we are bound together as children of God. Now, we don't have to impose that understanding on the people we meet. This is really just to help me, to help us as individuals, to have a sense of where are we beginning this journey from in terms of encountering others. Another document that you should get your hands on is Nostra Aetate. You can Google it on the web, no trouble at all. It sits on the Vatican site. It's one of the world's easiest Vatican documents to read. It's probably only about 4 pages when you get it onto A4. And it was designed to actually speak particularly into the space where there were real issues going on, and not least of which, in 1965, it was relatively shortly, less than 20 years after the Holocaust. So it speaks quite strongly about anti-Semitism, the fact that people have no right to blame the Jews and to think that there's any justification in attacking Jewish peoples. It also mentions the other Abrahamic faith, Islam specifically, and it talks about Buddhism and Hinduism in particular. So arguably the 5 main religions, certainly of the day. And I'll unpack a little bit of that as we go through. Look, it's not perfect because it's not trying to answer all questions. When a document's only 4 pages long, there's a cost and how much it can actually address. But if you think that what we are talking about now in terms of religious diversity, the Catholic Church has formally been talking about for over 50 years. For over 50 years, the Catholic Church has been saying it's not only Catholics that get to heaven. It's my summary of what this document says. So it's worth a read. Here's a few quotes. So this task of promoting unity and love among people, indeed among nations, the Church considers above all in this declaration what people have in common and what draws them to fellowship. Just want to challenge you in your research. It's a good place to start by looking at similarities. It's a better next step to also look at differences coinciding alongside each other. One of the things we have to do if we're going to live in a religiously diverse world peacefully is to be able to be comfortable with the fact that people have completely different ideas from us, and that's fine. It isn't a challenge on my own faith. It isn't something that I need to counter, aggressively. It just is what it is, and there's fascinating things to learn. This image here is, those of you who have seen one from St. Peter's in Auckland, this is Mr. Stollenwerk. He and I and a bunch of Kiwis went to Israel to the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum. And actually, this is in Magdala, so where Mary Magdalene came from. This is the town where she was. This is a Muslim restaurant serving Jewish kosher food. Okay, it's that basic at times that religious diversity can coexist, right? They're serving Jewish food in a Muslim restaurant. Just keep ticking along. This quote from Hinduism is it's looking at this notion of contemplation of the divine via philosophical inquiry. It's acknowledging what are strong points in Hinduism. Remember, this is a Vatican document, a Catholic document. It's acknowledging that there's wonderful things happen when people think deeply about the nature of reality. And in this last sentence, they seek freedom from the anguish of our human condition, either through ascetical practices, so that's, hardships, and profound meditation, or a flight to God with love and trust. It's a Vatican document ascribing the concepts of love and trust in the divine, without saying what that divine is, because for Hindus, of course, there are many attributes of the divine, but associating those two words, I think, is fantastic. You will get a sense as I rip through this. I'm trying to get you to really think deeply that religious diversity isn't all about overcoming a whole lot of angst and anger and violence. In many cases, there is a huge amount of goodwill already existing between religious communities. It quotes Buddhism here. Look, I'll link to the last one. The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. This is a summative paragraph that it puts in at the end of the sections on the 5 main religions, and claims that they often reflect a ray of truth which enlightens all. It's a Vatican document saying we can look to other faiths and be inspired. We can discover something of the reality of God that is outside of our tradition without setting aside our own traditions, but there is something to be learned about the reality of the divine. Okay, if we look to what Francis is saying himself, there's a few key concepts to pick up here. Francis is saying you cannot ignore interreligious dialogue and claim to be a Christian. He's saying it's constitutive of our faith. We can't set it aside and just follow a Catholic line. We actually need to engage with others so that our own faith can grow, our own Christianity can grow. The other thing he says in a different document or a different comment, look, when you meet people from different faiths, they're not going to want to meet a sort of watered down Catholic. They actually, if they know you're a Catholic, they're going to want to know someone who is a Catholic and grounded in their faith. They don't want you to talk it down, to try and ignore bits. They want to know, like, for example, I had a conversation with 3 or 4 university students, and they come up to me and they says, why do you put Isa in the way of God? Isa is the Muslim word for Jesus. Why do you put Jesus between you and God? Why not go straight to God? And I said, well, for Catholics, we believe that Jesus is God. Jesus is God's son, but Jesus is also God. That's part of the mystery of the Trinity. And they go, oh, I didn't know. That makes sense. If you are praying directly to Jesus and you are praying to God, they could understand it. Whereas an instinct to water that down is usually a mistake in interfaith dialogue. It does depend who it is that you're talking to. Francis says that it's critical that we learn to live alongside each other, to have these conversations, to develop harmony from where we are, not to actually have to turn us all into, you'll hear me say this again, the song, what we need is a great big melting pot, is complete nonsense. It doesn't exist in the religious diversity world. What we need is welcome and acceptance, not tolerance, because tolerance doesn't go far enough. We need welcome and acceptance of other faiths, other religions, so that together we can build communities that nurture one another, support one another in the hard times and in the good times. And we don't all have to be the same. It would be dreadful if we were. And he says that surely fostering of unity is a noble task, which is incumbent upon all who have a heart, the good of the whole human family. So from the top, Francis is saying something that's quite in line with what I'm telling you here, that religious dialogue and building faith communities is a critical. I just want to show you a few pictures, sort of get another context. Okay, here's a Catholic guy. This is me standing at the Western Wall praying. It was a profound experience for me to one of the holiest sites for Jews to be able to pray to the same God in whom they believe, but with a number of different understandings, and to be welcome there. This here is the Station of the Cross, where Simon of Cyrene took up the cross of Jesus. The understanding is that pretty much in this place, that event took place. This is in a Jewish city where many Muslim people actually live. Now, the next day, so this was taken at about 11 o'clock at night. This was taken at 3 o'clock the following day. Absolutely crowded. Here's some poor Muslim girls coming home from their school, because it was a Friday, trying to get past all these Christians that have sort of crowded the place. This guy's turning around because just behind there's a Muslim fella in his mobility scooter trying to get home, right? So he's going on his horn of his mobility scooter to try and get people out of the way so that he can get through. In the middle of it, most of these people that I would imagine are probably tourists trying to get to one of the most holy sites that they can imagine, the way of the cross with Jesus. And it works. There was no sense of violence. There was no, people would keep going about their daily business. This again, another shot of the wall. This is where I wrote, it's common to write prayers and to actually place them into the wall. I wrote a prayer for my son Colin and for my wife Jan and placed it in the wall at that place. It was a sacred place for me, even though it doesn't come directly from my own tradition. I haven't got too many of these, don't worry. If you look up here, I took a few photos, kosher McDonald's. So if you're in Israel, McDonald's doesn't have cheese and meat, obviously. So it has, you can't get a cheeseburger at a kosher McDonald's. And you also can't get a milk thick shake with your burger. So that's why it's got a blue in the end. Works fine. Look at these kippah here. So these are, Jewish men put a kippah on their head when they pray. You can get them in all sorts. Look, here's one with kiss. There's the range of these. Now, I'm not saying that all Jewish people, deeply, profoundly, wholly engaged people wear these all the time, but you'd see people wearing these around the place as a sign of their Judaic identity, but also it was something that they were having a bit of fun with. Religious diversity, it doesn't fit into the box that you might think you're wanting to push it. Diversity is literally that, incredibly diverse. Here we have the entrance to the Holy Sepulchre. This is the most holy place on earth for Christians, place of the resurrection, place of the crucifixion. If you come through this door and immediately turn right, see behind this window, you're literally where Calvary stood. They've built this building up around Calvary. This ladder here was put in place by one group of people when they decided that they wanted to do some renovations or a bit of a tidy up around the place. 3 different, completely separate Christian groups claim this, all from different, Orthodox tradition and Catholic tradition. And the reality is then that sort of talks fell down between them. The ladder's been up there for over 100 years. They couldn't decide who was allowed to actually go and get it and put it away again. So it's stayed there ever since. It's a symbol, literally a symbol of the need for ecumenical talks to carry on. So this is amongst Christians. These Christian groups give the key to the door of this most holy place for Christians to a Muslim family. It's a Muslim family that unlocks it every morning and locks it up every night because they basically don't trust each other to be able to take responsibility for it. It's sort of wonderful. It's sort of real. This is what they have there. I'm sorry it's a bit blurry because it was a bit dark, but this crucifix is put in the exact place that Jesus is supposed to have died on Calvary. And this woman who's under this sort of altar, you can put your hand through a hole in the floor and touch the stone where, the stone off Calvary itself. If she stood up, turned around, then you would stand looking over a balcony, and over here and just down there is the place of the resurrection, the tomb the place that they've built around it. That's how close the tomb of the resurrection was to the place where Jesus was crucified. It's less than 100 meters. And again, in a Jewish city, sort of with Muslims all around and claiming some sense of it, it's an incredible place to visit. Religious diversity sort of works. I'm not saying it's not fought, because of course in that same land there is deep turmoil. Often religious diversity gets associated with political injustice and political need for freedom. I'm not trying to overly simplify it, but I do want you to actually concentrate on how it can work as well. So this, I mentioned at one stage that Nostra Aetate particularly focuses on anti-Semitism to create a voice that actually says it's not okay to speak against the Jews. It's worth looking up. There's the quote reference there for NA4. So look, in general, there's a few things that I've learned. One is you can't actually have dialogue with a religion. It's literally impossible. You can't get an entire religion into a room, but you can actually speak to a person and hear their story as they can hear yours. As I mentioned, sharing common ground is a great place to start, but it is so much more profound to talk about things that are completely opposite in terms of understandings of faith. And people will share it. I mean, this is probably completely inappropriate, but I remember going to a session where a person was talking about whether or not somebody had ever come out to you as being gay, and that the reason that probably that's never happened is because they sense that you wouldn't actually accept them for who they are. This is completely different, but sits in a similar space. That often, if you are open and if you enter into a dialogue, people will tell you all sorts about what it is that they believe and why they believe it. If they think they're going to be judged, it's quite a different experience. Never assume what the other person, that they knows what you're talking about. Religious diversity, each religion has an incredible wealth of language associated with it. For us, words like Eucharist and reconciliation and miracle and transubstantiation, there's so many terms that you could use in this context. Every religion has those sorts of terms. So it's worth actually, when you are talking with somebody, to unpack some of those terms, unless they turn out to be somebody who actually knows more about your religion than you do. This is incredibly common as well. Often people actually have done some reading and research around it. They know exactly what it is that they're talking about. Finally, just to reiterate again, that be yourself, including being a Catholic. It's actually okay and expected. In the same way that if you're talking to a Buddhist person, you don't want them, and you're wanting to know something about their Buddhist identity, you don't want them to sort of sell it short. The booklet unpacks this well. There's 4 ways that interreligious dialogue takes place. One is simply living together in a spirit of friendship, reaching out to one another. This happens in COVID, certainly happened in the events of March 15. People came and prayed and stood outside mosques and gathered, just being human beings reaching out. We actually write letters. Our committee writes letters we write a dozen, 15 or so of these a year to various religious communities. wishing them well for whatever's happening. So particular feast days, we don't claim that we know everything about it, but we actually say, on behalf of the New Zealand Catholic Bishop, send you warm greetings as you celebrate the birth of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. Fantastic man. If you look him up, a martyr, somebody who was brutally treated, but said amazing things, a great man of peace. There's no problem with us acknowledging the goodness that exists within other religions, wishing them well. So on behalf of the bishops, if you like, we send these regularly, and they have done for 10 years or so. We send letters like this. I mentioned about that. The other aspect of interreligious dialogue is that of action. So what do we actually do? You can go to, you can organise things. Like I know the Catholic Church here had in Dunedin, there was a woman in my parish who wrote the actual application for refugees to come to Dunedin. And that reaching out, we don't expect them to stop being Muslims when they arrive. We want them to be Muslim people that are welcomed in our city, and we go to great lengths to make sure that takes place. But it's a way of actually dialoguing through action. There's many interfaith committees and you can, and events that tend to take place. The other one is standing up for others. Our committee has written twice, sadly, once in Wellington, once in Dunedin. Jewish graves were desecrated with swastikas. And we wrote to the Jewish community, and we wrote a letter to the newspapers to say how deeply offended we were that would happen to people of other faiths. We can stand up for each other, not necessarily in a context of faith, but knowing that they are members of other faith communities, and we stand by them and supporting them, especially when things aren't good. The other area is that of theological exchange. We can learn about what other people believe, and we can talk about that. So this picture here is of a National Interfaith Forum, the last one actually that was held in Wellington. It's taken in the Beehive. A range of people get together and talk with one another about issues associated, with interfaith. It's mostly listening, speaking, hearing, and laughing. You laugh a lot when you're engaged in interfaith. And there's so many funny stories, situations that occur. I mean, my very first Eid al-Fitr, I was that nervous. I was facing the wrong way. Suddenly realised that everybody was looking at me because they were facing towards Mecca, and I didn't know where Mecca was in this building. So I'd leaned against a wall with another fella. As I realised they were all sort of facing this direction, no one wanted to offend me by going up and saying. I sort of got up and started to wander away, and then realised I'd stood in a small plate of dates. So I had to carefully sort of pick it up and wander away. It was deeply embarrassing. Two guys laughed and came up to me and says, "Don't worry, I've done that myself." I'm sure they haven't, but it's not all heavy. There's a lot of joy that can be had in engaging with others. The fourth area is that of religious experience, of actually sharing in prayer, sharing in gatherings where you express your own religious identity. I met this man here as he was writing his mandala in the Buddhist place in Dunedin. It's a house. It's a lovely old house. And he was explaining to us what it was that he was doing and how he was doing it as he was actually making this. This is in Auckland. There was a song festival of people of all sorts of different cultures came together and sang with each other. And they sang from their own religious contexts. Very, very powerful. And the reality is that you can be open to God speaking through the words of other faiths. It's often profound. I once heard a national peace lecture, a Muslim woman who looked after at a university. She looked after a course for chaplains. She was a head at a university. I can't remember the name of the university. And she said, in her university, doing chaplaincy courses, there are Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, all sorts. No one ever loses their faith, she says. She's never once heard of anyone crossing over to another faith or losing their faith altogether. Everyone benefits. Everyone you get challenged in having to express in words your own beliefs, and you get the opportunity to engage with others. What also goes on, which is, I think, is the fifth dialogue, is this inner dialogue where you're actually thinking, should I be doing this? What's happened? What have I just heard? The second time I went to an Eid al-Fitr prayer and meal, I was fascinated by a 2-year-old who was in the room with his dad, and his dad was standing and kneeling and placing his face to the ground and standing and praying. The 2-year-old was holding on to his leg, and then he would do a bit of bowing and a little bit, and then he would wander off, and he would sort of sit and play and wander around the room and stuff. Then he would come back to his dad, and he would sort of then do a few more motions of the prayer. And I thought, it's exactly how Catholics learn to pray. With their parents, they go to mass, they understand how it works. There's something quite beautiful about seeing that in another context as well. And it's important to actually engage honestly and prayerfully with the struggles and that are going on. I personally don't believe you can do anything wrong in terms of engaging with people of another faith if your heart is in the right place. If you are deeply reflecting on what your faith means to you and who you are. I've been in situations where I've thought this isn't a prayer that resonates with my own identity, and I've not spoken, but I've taken the opportunity to listen for God's voice and being present in that place. You don't have to and shouldn't go counter to your own religious tradition. I know, a common event that people are invited to is the bathing of the Buddha. And on Buddha's birthday, a number of Buddhist communities pour water over the statue of Buddha, and they invite everyone to do the same. My sister Bertha in Christchurch, who's well into her 80s, she said the first time she did that, she thought, what on earth am I doing? Am I actually selling my soul? Are we going to go to hell for this? And I don't think she necessarily thought she was going to go to hell, but it makes you think, what am I doing? And then she said, what I'm doing is acknowledging the faith of those people who have invited me to be here with them. They know that I don't believe in this, but they've invited me to participate. That's enough. There's a spectrum of understandings that when you're engaging in religious diversity, you are challenged and challenged and challenged all the way along the way. And what's our job? Our job's to engage in the dialogue, to see where that takes us. Finally, look, this is one of my own personal, a great day. I met the Dalai Lama myself. I shook his hand. When I was teaching in class, I used to say the Dalai Lama came over to New Zealand to meet me. I'm not sure that was entirely well. I do not want to true at all. But this is the Dunedin Interfaith Council at the time. A huge range of people all entering into the complexity of what is religious dialogue. And there is huge complexity. But what are we called to do? It's a necessary condition for peace in our world. And so it is a duty for Christians as well as other religious communities. I sincerely believe that. I think it's fantastic work. I feel privileged to be part of it. And it's fantastic that you are looking at this from a scholarship perspective. I would hope as you climb into it that you would also look at it from a personal perspective of how you might actually engage. It's probably not with COVID, unfortunately. What I was going to say to all of you was get out there, get involved. If you're in Auckland, there's a lot of things that the Auckland Interfaith community are doing. Unfortunately, most of it will be shut down for COVID, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So, Lynn, that is me so far. Happy to answer any questions.
Right, so thank you very much, Colin, for that so far. What we've done in the past is that if somebody has a question, rather than everybody trying to sort of wave or whatever, what we do is down the chat at the bottom, if you just write your question in the chat, and then as they come through, I'll just ask Colin the questions, and Colin will hopefully answer them for us. So do we have any questions? This is always a fun part while we wait. Okay, so our first question there is, do you think Catholic schools could do more to encourage interreligious dialogue in New Zealand? And if so, how?
So we have, mostly we only deal with religions in the current curriculum in year 12, really. And so I think that definitely we could do it earlier. And in the new RE curriculum that none of you will get to see that we're writing, we certainly at year 10, we are looking at closely at Islam, year 12 and year 13 and year 11. We're actually going to be introducing bits there. So we're going to, definitely we can introduce more in terms of learning about it. The second thing is that Catholic schools are actually quite engaged because there are people of a range of faiths already in our schools. If your school is big enough, even if it's small, it's be surprising how many people actually belong to different faith communities, but we don't tend to talk about it. I think the short answer is yes, we could do more. The much easier answer is don't you wait, engage in it now, reach out, look at what's happening. I mean, I talk to people in taxis. If you're you might be in taxis very often, of course, but often what they've got on the dashboard tells you exactly what religion they're from, and I'm in immediately. I'm straight away talking with them about what's what. I remember I had a Hindu taxi driver just a few weeks ago, and I said, so what's this? I've just heard that Hindu women often, this was because a friend of mine has a student who's homestaying with her, and she was saying that her mother used to fast on Tuesdays every now and then as a Hindu. I said, what's that? And he goes, oh, they're very serious Hindus. I'm one of the Hindus, he said. I just sort of don't pray very much. I just sort of pray in my cab and whatever, because I sort of think that everyone's sort of just trying to get on with each other. And I thought, yeah, that's like Catholic, eh? That's like, there's plenty of Catholics that have got that same idea. He didn't have a blue clue. It was wonderful. Yeah, sorry.
The second question is, how does one manage to positively interact with other faiths while defending their own?
Yeah, so the key word here is defending. And see, I think it was attributed to, I think, St. Francis, although he never said it. Preach the gospel every day, and if you have to, use words. You know, that the life that you actually live and the way that you speak with others by far is the strongest example of who you are as a Catholic person. If they know that you are Catholic and you speak with them, at no stage have I ever gone into battle for the fact that Jesus is the Son of God and he is our Saviour. That's something I believe in the core of my being. But other people understand that, and other people have heard me talk about the place of Jesus in Catholic theology, my understanding of what it is to be Catholic. But they're often wanting to just know about, you know, why do you stand up and sit down at church a lot if they've been to a funeral or something or other, you know, and they've seen that happening. They'll talk to you about that. It's often at much sort of lower levels, but it's an opportunity to speak. I have heard people that have started to talk down their own stuff, but I don't ever undermine my own faith, and people don't want to hear that. There's plenty of opportunity to actually defend it. It's never been a challenge for me. I think people that don't engage in, or haven't had the opportunity maybe to engage in interreligious dialogue, they think that this is going to be an issue all the time. In my experience, people are very, very respectful of another person's faith.
Our next question. We tend to have more students of other faiths. How do we initiate these discussions in class without making them uncomfortable or putting them on the spot? So
what I used to do when I was teaching, one is if you've got, like I remember we had a couple of Buddhists in a class that I was teaching, they were international students. I just bailed them up beforehand and says, hey, can I ask you some questions in class about your own faith tradition? And they said, yeah, that was fine. And so I did. It can be as simple as that. The other one is that anyone in a Catholic school knows that they have actually signed up to a Catholic curriculum. So on the whole, they're expecting to hear Catholic stuff and to be taught in a Catholic context. So it's rare that they get angry that a Catholic stance is being pushed. So when the dialogue takes place, when the questions are being asked, it's really important that you don't enter into a context where, okay, so you do this, but we do this. So that, you know, there's, okay, we see what you do, but we always do it better. It's quite easy to talk about, that sounds very similar to the way that we pray. That when you actually talk, you use incense, we use incense as well. What does incense mean for you? We use incense because of this. If you can, you sort of need to know your territory a little bit. On the whole, again, my experience of having young people in the class from other faiths, they don't feel uncomfortable having Catholicism talked about because they're in the school, they know that's going to happen. And if they've had a little bit of warning, and if you're respectful, and the teacher often has to sort of gauge this because sometimes the kids will get a bit carried away, but you can actually keep it in a really respectful place. And I heard at one time we were talking in class about this sort of stuff. We'd done the Year 12 World Religions unit, and then we headed off on Year 12 retreat. It just happened to be the case. Happened to, 11:30 at night, the kids were hunkered down in the hall. There was about 8 or 9 of them. Full on interreligious dialogue was taking place. It was absolutely fantastic. I stopped myself from stepping in and telling some of the Catholic kids, actually, that's not true. We don't actually believe that. Because there's a few things I was saying, I'm thinking, oh man, I'm going to have to fix that when we get back to class. But it was just this great sort of conversation. And that's what we're sort of aiming for. It's not to say that the really heavy stuff doesn't have to happen as well, but some of it is quite straightforward. Yeah.
Okay, we've got 3 more questions. Oh, the questions are coming through fast and furious now. Christians are called to evangelize. How does this work when we are engaging with others of different faiths?
Yeah. Park your evangelizing energy a little. Again, we're evangelizing by telling the truth of the Gospels. That's what we do when we evangelize. It's, I believe, deeply offensive to assume that somebody else's faith that is at the core of their being is something that needs to be changed. I can hold on to an understanding that Christ is God's Son. Christ is central to my life and to the life of the church. I don't have to force that on someone else, but I can tell them what Christ means to me. And then they might want to know, what Christ might mean to them, but that is something that I'm quite happy in an interreligious dialogue sense to leave to God. That's God's dialogue with them. I think if someone wants to go in and proselytize to actually try and look at converting, that's a deep mistake. But if you go into interreligious dialogue with the concept that I am evangelizing in the best sense, I am spreading the word, the gospel word, in what I say and how I do and how I live, then every moment of your life you're evangelizing. Yeah.
Okay. What do you think are the greatest obstacles to interreligious dialogue in the present and future?
I could name about 20 things. I'll limit it a little. One, the media doesn't give you a really good idea of what's going on between faith communities. It's far too polarizing. Dualism is this concept that people are either tall or short, or they're large or small, they're thick or they're clever, whatever it is. Religions are often put into dualism. You're either somebody who believes or somebody who doesn't, or you're a member of one faith and you're against everybody else. That's not true. That's simply not true. The other thing is that people don't actually engage in religious dialogue. We're a little bit frightened. I talk to people in lifts. If you're in an elevator, to me, it's an opportunity to say, hello, how's your day going? That can be a great way to start in terms of interreligious dialogue. You can ask a Sikh person, why do you wear that on your head, that turban on your head in a lift? Because it's a bit unfair. But don't be afraid if the opportunities arise where you can actually ask a question and you think, actually, this is the case. And case it cagely, look, I'm not sure if I should ask this, and please don't be offended, but I am wondering. And then the person can speak, and then you can gauge from them whether or not this is how we communicate with one another. I think that the muddying of the waters between culture and religion, or the distancing between culture and religion, is a mistake in our country. I think New Zealand needs to wake up to actually the fact that interreligious dialogue is as important as intercultural dialogue. Those messages need to actually come through. Fear is probably the biggest thing. We're actually afraid of all sorts of things, hurting people's feelings, afraid that we don't know enough about our own religion, afraid that people will ask a question that will put me on the spot, or will say something that I get offended by. It's such a spectrum. We need to get on with it.
Okay. Engaging with all religions, not just those religions, is evident that it brings benefits. However, what are the connotations of engaging with cults? If there is a problem, how do we distinguish religion from cult? It's quite a good one.
Yeah. So you've got an opportunity now, while it's still in the curriculum, because it's going to disappear in the new curriculum, to engage with that year 13 stuff on sects and cults, because there's fantastic stuff in there. Cults nearly always try to switch off your brain. One of the main things that cults do is they try to eliminate your individuality, to crush your personal identity, your ability to express your own individual thoughts and opinions. They tend to sort of push towards a single source for answers. They tend to use techniques like limiting food so that you're physically not as strong as you might otherwise be. They use techniques for brainwashing. Doesn't actually exist, but there certainly are techniques out there that make you think in a particular line. My experience with engaging with religions is they never use that. They're usually open and welcoming. If they're not open or welcoming, it's because often they're just getting on with their own thing, but people don't tend to be trapped and unable to move from one place to another. All of human society shares things with cults. I mean, anybody who goes to a school where there is a uniform, you are looking at a system which is trying to push you into a shared common identity, which is that of belonging to your school. It's not actually a bad thing. Religions too have things that actually we share in common. The way that Catholics make a sign of the cross, for example, is a sign of when we walk into a church, we will dip our fingers in the font to make the sign of the cross as we go in. People from the outside might look at that and say, okay, that seems a bit cultish. We know that we have choice around that, and we know that we can make decisions. So you do need to keep your eyes open. It's very important that you keep your brain engaged when you're actually talking with people of other faiths, and in your own faith as well. As Catholic people, we don't want people that have switched their brains off. So yeah, and in my experience, cults tend to have very little to do with interreligious dialogue, but it is part of what you're looking at in terms of religious diversity.
Okay, thank you, Colin. I'm part of an interfaith group in Palmerston North, and my question is, how can we engage more young people to such groups and discussions, or are we already making a difference?
Well, Palmerston North is one of the fantastic high points in terms of the interfaith realm in New Zealand. They do absolutely stunning work. And I know Palmerston North has set up cafe discussions so that young people have actually, and there's a book, Mary Esther has collated some of the feedback from that. There's a book of young people speaking into the interfaith space that was only put out earlier this year. I think it was actually published. So if you want to get in touch with me, I can pass on Mary's contacts for that. Look, I taught for 22 years in a school. One of the things I am still aware of, and I'm still engaged obviously in teaching, I just don't get to see kids as much as I would like. Our young people are amazing. They have incredible capacity to solve their own problems and to climb in and make a difference in the world. They also are often their worst enemies in terms of not putting their best foot forward. There's so many decisions to be made in terms of how much time you've got and what you can invest in. My challenge would be to the young people listening is to look out for what's going on in the interfaith world, actually make a decision yourselves to engage with that or to set it up. A lot of universities have actually got interfaith groups. I know the Dunedin one is really struggling at the moment. So a lot of university students have come in because there's a lot of changeover and they're trying to re-establish it. But at the moment, there's only about 5 people that are wanting to be part of the university, which is effectively a youth interfaith group. So what's happening is that the old wrinkly interfaith committee is trying to help support them in making that happen. So one level, you can get in touch with our committee, the New Zealand Catholic Bishops Committee for Interfaith Relations. We would love you to email us and ask some questions. We would probably put it back on young people themselves to set up some opportunities, but we can certainly connect people with one another. We desperately need young people to be engaged in this, because the other thing that's going on is that the dialogue of New Zealand is largely secular. And so what happens when we start to look at this concept of religious diversity, it's in contrast to what many would consider mainstream New Zealand, which is secular, which doesn't have a faith stance. It's not true. Faith is a huge, huge dimension. I remember in the recent census where Christianity for the first time dropped below 50%. I heard a Presbyterian lecturer was talking at Otago University, and he said, okay, so 48% of New Zealand is Christian. 48% of New Zealand is Christian, he said. 48%. It was just because we were sort of, as a bunch of chaplains and DRSs were in the room, and we were thinking, oh yeah, it's on a slide. But the reality is, by far, the bulk of New Zealand society has religious convictions. It's important to engage in this. Yeah.
Okay, and that really sort of leads on to the next question. In what ways does religious diversity have a positive impact on society?
Look, it's good to be challenged. It's actually good to come across other people that have very different ideas than us, because it makes us think about where we are. My metaphor, and I've shared this with a lot of RE teachers, for a person of faith in a Catholic school should be somebody who's standing on one foot and people are actually prodding them with their fingers, so they've got to keep working to keep their balance. We need to engage with people of other faiths because they have these beautiful understandings of the world that we can then take into our own understandings of the world without bringing in all their concept of who God is and the likes. But they have quotes on what peace means. They have proverbs and whakatoki which show us ways that we can interact with one another that just look at the world in a way that we hadn't thought before. I mean, Sikh people, if you've ever met Sikh at a formal occasion, one of their core missions is to feed humanity, to feed people. So the food is always fantastic in anything that they've ever organised. If you're in an interfaith group, first thing you do is, if you're having a big gathering, is you reach out to your Sikh friends and say, would you be able to, help? Or usually you don't even need to seek them, because they will be there at the onset. Now, I've thought about that such a lot. I mean, my wife and I started years ago, regularly, every time we go to Mass, we put food into the St. Vincent de Paul basket. It's tiny compared to what Sikh do, but it was me reflecting on the fact that these Sikh people have a deep religious commitment to feeding other people. That's what it can do for us. It will not eliminate, but it will mitigate a lot of the false understandings that are out there. I've never met in my dialogue a violent Muslim person. I know there are violent Muslim people in the world, and I know that my Muslim friends are deeply, deeply offended and concerned that there are people who claim that their Islam faith causes them to cause violence. When I speak to them, I get an understanding. They're desperately afraid that their young people will be converted to something like ISIS, desperately afraid that, some of us might worry that young people are going out and using drugs or something like that. Many Muslim families are worried that in their rooms or online that their beautiful young kids are connecting with these violent terrorist type organizations, and that they won't know about it, and that suddenly they will be broken. If we hear these stories, it can't help but grow our understanding of one another. My experience of interfaith dialogue is that it gives you great hope in the world, whereas the media often sells a story that does the opposite. Not always. There's some wonderful stories the media has put out, but often it is hopeless.
It's interesting you're saying that about the Sikh community. Just to think, here in New Lynn, which is just down the road from where I live, the local Sikh community are doing drive-through food bank. They did it during COVID lockdown last year, and they're doing it again this year. And we've got one of the local supermarkets, which is a Spice World, it's called, which is owned by a Sikh family. They have said anybody can come to their supermarket and take whatever they need during this COVID-4 lockdown, and they don't have to pay for it. And there'll be no questions asked. It's sort of pretty amazing to see. Do you believe that there is a universal truth? Do you believe that there is universal truth between all religions, or is it excluding some religions?
Look, I just sow a seed of caution here. There's an instinct to try and work out how all religions actually are completely the same thing. It's a common thing you hear that everyone's really worshipping the same God anyway. What it does, that idea, is that it undermines their reality of who the divine is from another culture, that the theology that they've taken over decades, centuries, millennia to construct. Our job is not to deconstruct it, to try and fit it into a box that we are happy or we think everything should fit in. I believe that the divine resonates across all religions for sure. I wouldn't try and actually articulate exactly what the divine is, God's presence. We can certainly claim things like love, and in a Catholic context, God is love, where love is present, God is present. We can certainly share those things across religions, but it's actually a mistake to go looking for, I believe, to go looking for those things that are the universal truths. What we go looking for is the things that resonate with you and with me, and that we can actually have a conversation about, so that we continue to grow rather than bring ourselves to an end point that won't have any opportunity for growth. It becomes limiting. I think the job of interfaith dialogue is to actually always look for more, something that will help lead us on. If you talk to Buddhists, many Buddhists will be quite offended at being called a religion. So the notion of a God is completely, for many Buddhists, not all, but for many Buddhists, is something that they just don't want to engage with at all. So if you look at even just say Buddhists and any Christian, then we have understandings in terms of our common sense of aroha, of love for humanity, but we don't have a common theology at all, and looking for one is a mistake. Yeah.
Right, now you've got 4 minutes, Colin.
Okay.
And you've got 2 questions left.
Okay.
Right. So your next question. What would you say? Would you say that secularism is the greatest challenge to all faiths?
I would go so far as to say that secularism is fast becoming a faith of its own. People proselytize to belong to secularism. They don't use the term, more than any other faith is doing at the moment. The challenge that comes to people who say, I'm a person of faith, I believe this and this, from people who hold arguably no belief, is huge, and I think unfair. People are allowed to hold a non-religious stance in a much stronger way than most people are able to actually articulate their faith stance. If you stood up in a public space and decided to tell everybody that, at a public meeting, that you believed in Jesus and that Jesus should guide the decisions that's made in this meeting, you would probably get hounded down. Hopefully not if it was a Catholic meeting, but if it was just something in a council meeting. But if someone stands up and says that religious beliefs have no place in this debate, often that voice is allowed to actually speak. So the short answer is secularism is something to challenge, but many good, wonderful people hold secular views. We're not judging the people. We're actually trying to look at the religious diversity that is broad enough so that people can hold all sorts of faiths, coexist with each other in harmony without trying to convert. And secular people, or atheists in particular, are very keen on conversion of others, and more so than most religions I know of.
Okay then, and the last question. What could be done to convince a wider majority to engage in interfaith dialogue?
there's probably a lot of things. I come back to the fact that people talking about their experience of having engaged in interfaith dialogue is usually the greatest catalyst. When you talk to someone who's been in this space, it just draws you in. It's absolutely fascinating. Do you know, we were at a meeting one time, we were talking about rituals at the start of a life that that Muslims whisper the name of Allah to the child as soon as it's born. And how beautiful is that? I never knew that. Basically, every Muslim person you ever meet, that's how their life started. It's just beautiful. You hear that and you think, I want to know something else. And when you have a question about something or other and you sort of start looking around at who might I be able to ask that to, it's great. Why not? It's fraught, I suppose, but why not in your Facebook groups and conversations and just someone else? Why not open up some of these questions and see what happens? And sure, it might get shot down or some people might come on with some pretty horrific sayings, but why not take the challenge and just see where it goes and then have the strength to be able to step back from an argument or to shut it down if something negative comes your way, but be open to the fact that these amazing things could be said. Okay. We've got to engage. First foot forward. We've got to step out. That's what we've got to do.
Well, we just literally hit 8 o'clock, Colin, so you've done really well. You've managed to answer all of the questions. I just wait for the Western Line train to go past here. It's good to see that there's nobody on the train apart from the driver. So the people out west are being good for their COVID lockdown. So right. I think for me, probably the one sentence that you said that really stood out for me was that religious diversity doesn't fit into the box you might want to put it into. And I think that's a really sort of good thing for us to think about, that to keep our minds much more open probably than what we sometimes are when we look to engage and to have discussions with people of other faith traditions. And hopefully by showing how we live, as you said, like St. Francis said, that maybe they will actually want to ask us some questions about what it is to be a Christian. So thank you very, very much, Colin, for this evening. I'm going to ask if you would, if you don't mind, just finish with a little prayer for us at the end.
Okay, so just a trick for young players: if you're ever saying a prayer in an interfaith context, don't launch into the sign of the cross at the start, which is nearly always what Catholics pray. It's not the end of the world if you do. I did. Normally what you would pray if you're in an interfaith context is you pray in a way that sort of is as inclusive as most people as you can. So in our context, loving God, we thank you for the gift of those who have been present in this conversation. We thank you for the wisdom of the room that's been spoken and unspoken. We ask you to bless all those people in our land who share this land together and hold different faiths. We pray for those communities who have faith in common, that they can support each other in this challenging time of COVID-19. We ask that you bless us in this journey of growing in wisdom about interfaith dialogue. We pray that you give us the strength and the opportunity to engage in dialogue ourselves. And we ask you to bless especially these wonderful young people, that they may be the champions of interreligious dialogue in the future, and may they get excellent scholarship grades. Amen.
Amen.